without further ado, let's move on. It's time to introduce our first speaker this morning. That is Dr. Fred Berlin, who founded the Johns Hopkins Sexual Disorders Clinic, and he is the director of the National Institute for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Sexual Trauma, a program that has been designated by the U.S. Department of Justice as a national resource site. He specializes in evaluating and treating adults and adolescents with psychosexual disorders and also treats victims of sexual abuse. Dr. Berlin has written numerous professional publications and performed peer reviews for professional journals such as the Journal of the American Medical Association and the American Journal of Psychiatry. He has been the recipient of a contract from the National Institute of Mental Health to prepare an annotated bibliography on sex offender etiology, which is the causes of offending and treatment. In Dr. Berlin's presentation entitled Paraphilias, a Mental Health Perspective, we will hear about paraphilic disorders from a mental health perspective and learn the difference between a paraphilia and a paraphilic disorder. It should be a novel change from hearing how we're monsters and predators from the reporters and prosecutors, so I'm sure we'll appreciate that, a little more educated look. We will also learn the difference between pedophilia and child molestation. The presentation will be divided into 4 segments: mental health assessment, etiology, that is what is known about the reasons for pedophilia, rationale for treatment, and treatment itself. The importance of prevention will also be discussed. So for those of you who don't know a paraphilia from a paramecium, get ready for a deep dive into psychosexual research. Dr. Berlin, welcome to NARSOL Live.
All right, sorry for the glitches here, everyone, in getting started, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. I'm hoping that what I will have to say today will be of some use to all of you. I know you're particularly interested in legislation, and there'll be a question period at the end where I'm happy to talk about some of the laws that are out there, my feelings about them, and so on. But today I really wanted to focus on letting you know what someone like myself in the mental health profession does in terms of evaluating people who have various kinds of sexual problems. I want to distinguish between someone who might have a sexual disorder from individuals who engage in sexual offending behavior. Just to talk for a few seconds, though, about some of the laws, just so you know my concerns. A lot of what we're seeing clinically lately are people who are in difficulty for having accessed child pornography, and the penalties for that are extremely severe, particularly in the federal system. And that's in spite of the fact that there's a great deal of literature now showing that the overwhelming majority of individuals who access child pornography but who have no history of actually ever approaching a child sexually, when they're followed prospectively, do not try to engage in child sexual abuse. So there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of educating and making a distinction between people who are perhaps having fantasies and looking at images on the internet from those who might be having desires to act in a somewhat different manner. As you all know, there are concerns about registration. There are lots of concerns about civil commitment, the idea that after someone's served all of their time, they then can be further deprived of their liberty. So I know these are some issues that some of you will likely have, but today, again, to stay on track, I really want to educate you a little bit about what I, as a clinician in this area, would do, and you can kind of make up your own mind the extent to which that is or isn't of use to you. As was mentioned a few moments ago, I'm going to divide what I have to say up into 4 sections. I'm going to talk first about how I would go about, or other mental health professionals in this field would go about, evaluating someone where there are concerns about problematic sexual behavior, whether legal or illegal. And I'll spend the most time on that because that's really the foundation upon which the rest of what we do tends to be based. Secondly, though, I want to talk a little bit about etiology, or cause. What do we know or what don't we know about the cause of some conditions such as pedophilia or the other paraphilic disorders, and I'll discuss in more detail what I mean by the paraphilic disorders shortly. Thirdly, I want to talk about the rationale for treatment, and I think this is particularly important because, as many of you know, there's a lot of cynicism out there in the public. Many in the public think that mental health professionals simply excuse sin by relabeling it psychopathology. And by the way, we have to be careful not to do that. I mean, there are people of sound mind who are just misbehaving. They may be misbehaving sexually, and we don't want to excuse that or diminish that by suggesting that their behavior is occurring in relationship to a legitimate and recognized psychiatric condition. On the other hand, we often don't spend much time thinking about the opposite end of the coin, which is where we are assuming someone is not having some sort of a psychiatric disorder, that they are simply misbehaving when indeed that's not the case. So I want to try to have some balance and talk about both ends of that spectrum. And then finally, in terms of treatment, obviously I'm not here to teach people how to do that, but I want to talk about some of the concepts that are related to treatment and why those are so important in terms of how we approach that issue. Now, the first thing I want to talk about in terms of talking to you folks about how I would go about evaluating someone is to make the point that the law defines an individual as a sex offender simply because of behavior alone. In other words, there are certain statutes on the books that prohibit particular kinds of behaviors, that make them illegal. An adult is not able in a legal way to have sex with an individual under the age of consent. An adult rightfully is not allowed to engage in coercive kinds of sexual activities and so on. And if one behaves in that way in violation of a criminal statute, one can be prosecuted as a sexual offender. The first thing that someone in mental health and working in this area needs to do is determine, A, is the behavior a reflection of any kind of a psychiatric condition? Because as I mentioned a moment ago, there are people who engage in sexual misconduct who do not have any kind of a psychiatric or mental health issue. And secondly, if it is a psychiatric condition, is it one that involves some aberration of sexual makeup? Now, there are many people, unfortunately, who commit sex offenses who do not have a paraphilic disorder or not sexually disordered. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that this morning, but just in terms of contrast, I want to give a couple of brief examples. A simple example of someone who might commit a sex offense but does not have a paraphilic disorder would be an instance where a man perhaps breaks into a home, he's trying to rob somebody, steal a television set, get some drugs, some money, whatever, finds a woman home alone and exploits the situation by sexually assaulting her. Clearly, in that circumstance, he can be prosecuted as a sexual offender, but he's not a paraphilic sexual offender. In other words, in the example I'm giving here, he's not predisposed to do this because there's something atypical about his sexual makeup. He may be someone who's just lacking a sense of conscience and moral responsibility. He may be hopped up on drugs, which is impairing his judgment and disinhibiting his impulses. But clearly, although he is engaging in sexual behavior of a criminal nature, he does not have a paraphilic disorder. He is not a sexually disordered sexual offender. The second example I'll give, and I think it's important simply because it's not thought about very often, but something that we've been doing for many years since the program at Johns Hopkins began, and that's to think about something we rarely take the time to think about, which are the problems faced by many mentally retarded or intellectually impaired individuals. We never stop to think about what it would be like, for example, to have the mental age of an 8-year-old and yet be experiencing the intensity of sexual desire that all of us experience as adults. Beyond that, if one is experiencing a strong sexual desires, as anyone would, how does someone who's intellectually impaired convince someone who is not to engage in sexual activities? None of us want to have sexual activities with someone who has the mental age of an 8 or 9-year-old. It's for that reason, not because they have pedophilia or a paraphilic disorder, which I'll talk about shortly, but because of their impaired coping skills, the unavailability of an age-appropriate partner, that some mentally retarded individuals will persuade, or perhaps in rare instances coerce, a child who may be of exactly the same mental age into sexual activity. Now, that person could still be prosecuted legally, particularly if they're not so limited as they're seen not competent to stand trial, they could still be prosecuted as a sex offender, someone who's committed child sexual abuse. But in the example I'm giving here, that does not mean that the individual has pedophilia or a pedophilic disorder. It does not mean that they're acting because there's something atypical or different in their sexual makeup. So I'm not going to talk any further about, excuse me, persons who engage in sexual misconduct who do not have a paraphilic disorder. But in focusing on the paraphilias, I want us to put that into perspective by remembering that there are many persons who do not necessarily fall into that category. Now, in terms of understanding the paraphilias, and I always try to talk in a way that stays as much as possible away from what sounds like psychobabble or psychiatric jargon, I just try to find what I hope are the most common sense ways of describing. And I think the way I've come to discover over the years it's easiest to be able to talk about the paraphilias is to make the point that we are not all created equal when it comes to sexual makeup. Now, not to be misunderstood, we are all of equal moral worth. We should all be seen as having equal moral worth. Everyone in our society should have equality of opportunity. But there are many ways, if we mean by equal, we mean the same, that people are not the same. Some are tall, some are short, some are intellectually gifted, some are less so. And one of the many ways in which we differ from one another, and considerably so, is in terms of our sexual makeup. And I'm going to talk about 4 ways that we differ from one another sexually. I've listed it here, and then I'll go back and talk about how that relates to the various paraphilic conditions. So first of all, just to put it into the proper context, we differ tremendously from one another in terms of the behaviors that either do or do not excite us or arouse us sexually, the behaviors we crave or don't crave sexually. There's many ways of saying it, but the first category I want to talk about where we differ is with respect to behaviors. The second way in which we differ is with respect to the potential category, potential partners, the potential category of partners we either are or are not attracted to sexually. Or again, we can say it in various ways, the kinds of partners we crave or don't crave sexually. These 2 examples I've given so far are qualitative differences in sexual makeup. There's also an intensity dimension. For some people, sex is on their mind a lot, that they have frequent desires for sex. For others, less so. So there's that intensity dimension. And then fourthly, although it doesn't have anything to do with sexual drive per se, or sexual appetite per se, we differ in our attitudes about our own sexual desires, and for reasons that I'll try to make clear subsequently, that can be important to understand as well. Now, let me then get into some of the paraphilias, and these are examples of paraphilias based on the kinds of behaviors that either do or don't arouse us sexually. And I'm going to go through quite a spectrum here, some of which are very unlikely to cause people to get into any difficulties of a criminal nature, and some of which are perhaps, and in fact are, very able to predispose individuals to be very dangerous and to get into serious problems in terms of societal danger and in terms of the community. Again, I'm going to give some clinical examples rather than deal with statistics to try to drive some of these points home. Now, the first example I'm giving of a paraphilic disorder based on the kinds of behaviors that someone does or doesn't find to be arousing or that they do or don't crave sexually is transvestism. And this is a condition in which an individual, almost always a man, is extremely aroused by dressing in clothing of the opposite gender. Now, unfortunately, some people will ridicule this or think it's a joking matter or whatever, but just to give a little example to show how important this can be, and again, in this case, to emphasize it from the mental health perspective rather than the criminal justice perspective. This was a 72-year-old gentleman I saw many years ago who came into the psychiatric unit as an inpatient, clinically depressed. A couple of weeks prior to coming in depressed and anxious and worried, he had a very mild stroke, and that had required that he be hospitalized for a short period of time. But he'd made a complete recovery from that stroke. It wasn't an area of the brain that causes people to become depressed. What was distressing him and worrying him terribly was that during this brief period of hospitalization, his wife had found, secreted in the closet, a cache of female clothing. And he had to acknowledge to her that for many years in private, he would put on these female clothing. It was very erotically, sexually arousing. He would masturbate while doing so. And he was extremely worried that his wife, now finding out that he's kept this a secret part of who he is for so many years, might leave him. He was worried what his children might think. They were grown now, but what would they think about this? And perhaps of equal importance to him, although he was 72 years of age, he'd not yet retired, and as it turns out, he was a local prominent pediatrician. Now, there's nothing about this paraphilic disorder that would make him in any way whatsoever a danger to his young pediatric patients. There's no evidence he had ever acted improperly in his role as a pediatric physician, but human beings, being as we are often affected as much by emotion as by intellect. And the fact of the matter is that many people would have had concerns about taking their child to this individual as a pediatrician, hearing what it was he had done. Now, the point I want to drive home here, and this will be important to understand throughout what I have to say, is that even though he was terribly worried about losing the respect and love of his wife, of his family, of not being able to retire with dignity, he was still not confident that on his own he was going to be able to stop engaging in these cross-dressing behaviors. Now, I've tried to stay away from the DSM, the diagnostic manual, and some of the more technical aspects of the paraphilic disorders. But at the bottom of this PowerPoint, I list what are the primary mental characteristics of any paraphilic disorder. And they are as follows. The individual with the condition ordinarily experiences intense, recurrent, sexually arousing fantasies and urges of a particular sort, and that particular sort depends upon the particular paraphilic condition. So in transvestism, those fantasies, those urges, are about dressing and clothing of the opposite gender. Now, I would put it to you that any man is physically capable of dressing in female clothing, though most men would feel rather embarrassed and mortified at the prospect of doing so. But to argue that the average man experiences intense, recurrent, sexually arousing fantasies and urges about dressing in female clothing to the point where it's an ongoing struggle for him to not act on those attractions would be to make a point that simply has no validity. I want to keep that point in mind as I briefly talk about some of these other paraphilias based on the kinds of behaviors that a person craves sexually. The second example you see on that PowerPoint is exhibitionism. Now again, I want to drive home the idea that we don't diagnose a paraphilic disorder or paraphilia from the mental health perspective simply because someone has behaved in a particular way. The college student who gets drunk or intoxicated at the Saturday afternoon football game, when hopefully we get back to having those, can be arrested and prosecuted for exposing himself in public. That certainly does not mean that we would be diagnosing him with exhibitionism. Again, in theory at least, the average man is physically capable of exposing himself in public, but the average man does not have intense, recurrent, sexually arousing fantasies and urges about doing so to the point where it's an ongoing struggle to prevent himself from acting. We published a study several years ago. It was a large study on recidivism of people with various kinds of paraphilic disorders, but 111 men in that study had been diagnosed with exhibitionism. Many of them had been arrested. They'd had to stand up in a court of law, embarrassed and feeling humiliated as others heard about what they had done. And yet, in the overwhelming majority of cases, until they had access to adequate treatment, they were not able to bring this behavior under control on their own. I want to take a minute here to make the point here about the relationship between the criminal justice system and those in mental health who are dealing with paraphilic disorders. And that's to make the point that in our society, we tend so often to think that virtually every problem can be solved either by one tougher piece of legislation, by tougher penalties, or by one new piece of law, perhaps introducing new forms of legislation. I want us to all think for a moment about that. If someone goes to prison because they're having recurrent, intense sexual fantasies and urges about exposing themselves sexually, or if someone goes to prison because they're experiencing sexual attractions to children, there's nothing about prison itself that can erase those attractions. There's nothing about prison that can enhance the capacity of an individual to successfully resist acting on those attractions. And sooner or later, most persons who engage in these behaviors are going to be out in the community. So the point I'm making is that just as with alcoholism or with drug addiction, yes, we have to have criminal justice laws. We can't have no sanctions or someone who is driving while intoxicated, but we're not going to solve the problem by simply emphasizing a criminal justice approach. When it comes to the paraphilias, I think that we have to have just as much research, just as much attention paid to the need for treatment as we now do in modern-day society with drug addiction and alcoholism. But when it comes to the paraphilias, we're still in the pre-Betty Ford era, where I think we often give lip service to treatment, where there's very little understanding about why these are legitimately psychiatric problems where people deserve help, deserve assistance, and we still, as a society in many cases, are thinking we can solve the problem by punishing it away or legislating it away. Now, I want to watch my time carefully. Just two briefly, paraphilias based on the kinds of behaviors that are arousing are opposite ends of the same coin, and that's masochism and sadism. And I wanted to talk about masochism because that's a condition in which the person themselves is actually the victim of their own paraphilic disorder. I also wanted to make the point that for reasons we don't fully understand, all of the paraphilias seem to affect men rather than women. Now, that's not necessarily unusual in mental health. For example, anorexia nervosa, an eating disorder, occurs mostly in women for reasons we don't understand, but we do see some men with it. And again, for reasons we don't fully understand, the paraphilias occur mostly in men, but we do see it in women. The reason I mention that here, though, is that masochism appears to be one of those conditions, one of those paraphilias that may occur as often in women as it does in men. Just to not use too much time, I'll give you a brief example of a young woman in Baltimore County many years ago who went missing. She was a very fine family. She was a very nice woman. And her family, of course, immediately became very concerned, and they called in the authorities. And one of the authorities did is they looked on her computer to see what kind of activities she'd been engaging in there. And they discovered she had disclosed to a man in either North or South Carolina that she was very aroused by engaging in masochistic sexual activity. She had repeated sexual desires to engage in these acts. And she was turned on by being held down, by being choked, by being subjugated. And in a completely voluntary way, she traveled down to the Carolinas to engage in these behaviors with this particular gentleman. She was not looking to be hurt. There was an understanding that he would stop at a particular point. He wanted to do so. But clearly, these are extremely dangerous behaviors, and one can easily miscalculate. And this is not a happy story. He was choking her, what she wanted him to do. This would excite her and turn her on, as it was a little harder for her to breathe. But it went further than either of those had intended, and she ended up dead. He wasn't charged with murder. It was clear that hadn't been the intent. I don't recall. It may have been charged with involuntary manslaughter. But the point I'm making here is that these intense, recurrent, atypical urges that this woman was experiencing, in this case, because it was a masochistic disorder, she was her own victim. Now, to make it clear, this is not as rare as people might think. A colleague of mine, Park Dietz, and a former FBI agent, sadly he's passed away a few years ago, Roy Hazelwood, wrote a little booklet for investigating authorities called Autoerotic Fatalities to help the authorities distinguish between a death that was due to a suicide, perhaps a homicide where they're faking the scene to look like an autoerotic fatality, or where it was actually due to sexual masochism. Now, in our society, as you all know, families are often hesitant even to talk about a suicide in the family. Imagine the horror of a mother who comes home, finds her young 17-year-old son hanging from the rafters. He wasn't intending to commit suicide. There was an escape mechanism. Out in front of them were a lot of sadomasochistic pornographic images. The escape mechanism fails, and he ends up dead. Just a terrible horror, and one that people are likely not going to talk about. But as I said, this occurs enough in our country every year that there are actually a manual available for investigators to become aware of that. An actor that some of you may have been aware of, David Carradine, who was in a lot of these kind of kung fu type movies, actually died of that condition. He had been married a number of times, and one of his wives talked about that afterwards. Now, the opposite end of the coin from sexual masochism is sexual sadism, and it doesn't take a mental health expert to realize how dangerous a person can be if an individual is not aroused by consenting, gentle, affectionate kinds of activities, but experiences intense sexual fantasies and urges about hurting, subjugating, dominating, terrorizing, even killing another human being. And most of the serial sexual murders in this country are committed by men who would meet the diagnosis of sexual sadism. Perhaps Ted Bundy was one of the best known who has that condition. I don't want to take time going into that. Thankfully, it's very rare, may not be as relevant to some of you as the conditions I'm going to be talking about, but indeed, it is one of the most serious of the paraphilic disorders. This is actually a letter I'll just show you briefly that was written by Mr. Bundy to myself back in 1984. I won't go into the details here. I elected not to actually go and see him. As you know, he was eventually executed. But clearly, he would be an example of someone with perhaps one of the most dangerous of all paraphilic disorders. And again, many of them are not necessarily dangerous. Most are not nearly this dangerous. But just to give you some idea of the full spectrum. Now, it was mentioned in the introduction. I want to make this point. It's a bit of an aside, but I think it's important. And that is that in the fifth revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, a change that was made that I agree with. And that was really to make the point that just because someone is different, in this case, different in their sexual makeup, that doesn't necessarily have to be the business of mental health, and it doesn't necessarily need to be the business of government or of legislators. If, for example, let me give you an example of sexual masochism, an individual is very aroused by engaging in being tied up by their partner, by maybe some kind of light spanking. It's fully consensual adults. Their individual is able to be in complete control of himself or herself. They stop when they're asked to stop. It doesn't. Nobody is getting seriously harmed. Researchers might want to study it and say, well, this is different. This isn't the predominant sexual interest of most people. Why is this person different in this way? But again, if they're not impaired, if they're in their functioning, they're able to be in complete control of themselves, they're not distressed by it, it's a paraphilia, it's something different about their sexual makeup, but it's not a disorder. If someone was sexually attracted to children, if they're aware of it privately, if they're in full control of themselves, they're not acting on those attractions, they're not really distressed by it, it's just something they're aware of in terms of their own makeup, that would still be different from the norm. It wouldn't be considered a disorder. But when an individual who is sexually attracted to children, and we're going to come to this shortly, is having a difficult time, they don't want to act on those attractions, but they're struggling, the temptations are difficult, they're having some impairment in their ability to control themselves, that would make it a disorder. Or if they're simply distressed, very distressed about the fact that they are experiencing these kinds of sexual fantasies, desires, urges, that would rise it to the level of a disorder. So we're not trying to say that because someone is different, even if being different in their sexual makeup, that's fine. If they're not impaired, they're not hurting anyone, they're in control, fine. But if they're having struggles, if they're distressed, they need professional help, we want to be there as a profession to provide it. Now let me get into the categories of paraphilias based on the kinds of partners that a person is or isn't attracted to sexually. I'm going to start with zoophilia, which is a very unusual condition, but I want to start there because it often is not something that creates a serious burden for the community, but because it gives a good instance of a good way of demonstrating just how different we are from one another in our sexual makeup. And zoophilia refers to a paraphilia in which the category of partner that a person is very much attracted to is an animal. Now, the point I want to drive home here is that when I talk about animals, the last thing that most of us experience is a sense of sexual excitement. To the contrary, most of us are feeling a sense of disgust or revulsion or all sorts of negative feelings. But that's just the point that I want to make here, is that the category of partner who for one person might be an extreme turn-off, for another person may be an extreme turn-on, making it very clear just how broad the spectrum of human sexuality actually is. And yet we live in a society where we rarely talk about this. Now, when I began talking about this years ago, I would say how very rare it is, and relatively speaking, I'm sure it's still pretty rare. But one of the things we've now been able to learn in recent years through the Internet, which in a sense can be a mirror into the privacy of people's thoughts, is what kinds of sexual interests they have. People are going to various sexual sites on the Internet. They feel they're doing it anonymously. They're doing it in the privacy of their homes. And yet we can look and see when we go out onto the Internet how many hits various locations are getting. And one of those common areas of hits, I think the second most common hits that exist on the Internet, sites that are accessed, are sexual sites. And within those sexual sites, on a daily basis, a remarkable number of people going to sites that show involvements of human beings with animals. So again, the point I'm wanting to make here is simply how broad the spectrum of human sexuality is and how little we talk about it. The second example of a paraphilia based on the category of partner that we may or may not be interested in being intimate with is necrophilia. And again, this is one that most of us would find absolutely repulsive because the interest is in having sex with a dead body, with a corpse. Again, I think it's clear to all of us how different this would be from what most of us are experiencing. And yet, in the work I've done, I've seen a number of cases in which this has actually been so. I have, for example, and these are all very tragic, seen a case of a man in Virginia who was working in a funeral parlor, and it was eventually discovered he was fondling the bodies who were there. And obviously that's horrible for the families to think that someone is doing this with the sacred remains of their loved one. I don't want to in any way minimize that, but this was also somebody who was experiencing these kinds of abnormal sexual cravings, and yet the law really has no allowance for that in terms of how to deal with someone like that. A second example was out in the state of Nevada, even more tragic, that I had seen, of someone who had gotten access to a child who had died of leukemia, a young child, and got the body out of a funeral parlor and was having sex with it. This man was actually apprehended. I was able to interview him clinically, and again was able to document clearly that he did have this necrophilic paraphilic disorder. Perhaps the most well-known case that I was involved with was the case of Jeffrey Dahmer. Mr. Dahmer was virtually incapable of sustaining arousal with someone who was alive. He was extremely aroused by being intimate with people who were dead. I know people are often interested in my experience with this, but I don't have the time to go into it here. But Mr. Dahmer actually committed his first killing at the age of 18 in Ohio, and it's well documented. For the next 8 years, he tried very hard not to kill again and didn't. He tried various methods that would be, in a sense, a surrogate for a dead body. At one point, and again, this is documented, he actually went to a cemetery, tried to dig up a dead body to try to deal with this urge to be intimate with one. That didn't work. It was the cold of winter. That was aborted very quickly. Secondly, for a sustained period of time, while living in his grandmother's home in Milwaukee, he had a male mannequin. He was pretending it was a dead body. His grandmother eventually finds that he just could not bring himself to explain to her what he was doing. She understandably asked him to get rid of it, and that attempt at a surrogate came to an end. Thirdly, he began going to gay bathhouses in both Milwaukee and Chicago. He was slipping some sleeping medicine into the drinks of the people who were with him in a purely voluntary way. They would fall asleep. The medicine had a kind of an amnesic effect. He would fondle them, pretending in his mind that they were a corpse. Obviously, very disturbing behavior, but something he was doing, trying to fight the urge to kill again. He was praying and going to church during that time period. Eventually, at the end of this 8-year period, he actually mistakenly drinks some of this halcyon-laced material. In the midst of that, he finally kills again after 8 years, and then after that, in response to his necrophilic urges, becomes tragically almost like a killing machine, out of control. Became very disturbed in his thinking after that. Excuse me. But clearly, this is an example of how dangerous a person can be made based upon a paraphilic disorder. The one I want to talk about in some detail here, and I want to watch my time, is pedophilia. And so let me do that. And I want to make the point and talk about it in as common sense a way as possible. That first of all, pedophilia is absolutely not synonymous with child molestation. And to talk about the way in which I think pedophilia can be best understood. Each of us could define for others, if we were asked, both a gender of partner and an age range of partner we either are or not attracted to sexually. I'll use myself as an example. I don't ever call on others. It's a very private matter. If you ask me to talk about the category of partner I'm attracted to, it's females and not males. I'm not making a value judgment. It doesn't make me better or worse than anyone else. That just happens to be the category I'm attracted to. I can go beyond that and tell you an age range of female that I would or wouldn't be attracted to in a sexual way. At the upper end of the spectrum, it's not because I'm a chauvinist who has something against the elderly, but if I'm honest about it, I'm just never tempted to have sex with a 95-year-old woman. At the bottom or lower end of the spectrum, though, and this is the much more important point, I'm never tempted to have sex with a 6, 7, 8-year-old child. I'm a father of 4 children. I have some grandchildren now. When my kids were younger, like any parent, I enjoyed expressing affection in a physical way, holding them, hugging. At no time was I having to remind myself there are laws out there or beware of the feelings. The feelings simply weren't there. I was never feeling tempted to have sex with a child of that age. Now, there's other people, when we ask them to talk about the age of partner and the gender of partner they either are or not attracted to sexually, tell us something very different. And there's actually a device called the penile plethysmograph that could demonstrate this physiologically. But most of the people I see clinically are quite honest about that. And they will say something very different than what I just said. When an individual says that the category of partner they are attracted to is a prepubescent child, that's all from the mental health point of view that pedophilia means. It's just a shorthand way of conveying information. That's all that any diagnosis is. And all that's told me so far is that this person I'm seeing, usually a man, is attracted to prepubescent children. I think it's tragic the way in which the media has hijacked this diagnosis. They turn it into making it this demonizing pejorative. They act as though when you say pedophilia or that a person's a pedophile, it's synonymous with saying that he is a child molester. That would be like saying that everyone who was an alcoholic is a drunk driver. Again, they just confabulate all of these terms. But to not lose track of the time and to get on with this, all I've said so far to mental health people, when I use the term pedophilia, it's that someone is attracted, usually a man, to prepubescent children. Now, we can divide the cake up. If it's a man attracted to boys, it's homosexual or same-sex pedophilia. If it's a man attracted to girls, it's opposite sex or heterosexual pedophilia. A man attracted to boys and girls, it's bisexual pedophilia. Now, another way of dividing the cake with pedophilia is whether or not the person is attracted only to children, and if so, by definition, that's the exclusive form of pedophilia because they're attracted exclusively to kids. And the other category, the non-exclusive form, the person is still attracted to age-comparable peers, but in addition to that, they have much, much stronger attraction to children than do the rest of us. Now, the question sometimes comes up, I may have it on the next PowerPoint, why, if a person is attracted both to children and to adults, don't they just choose to conform their behavior to legal standards and just stay involved with adults? There's many answers to that question, but sex is, in one sense, in fact it is, a biologically based appetite. Excuse me. And appetites can have within them certain tastes. When it comes to the appetite for food, I can have a big turkey dinner, but I'm still craving that piece of strawberry shortcake for dessert. That is the dilemma faced by the person with a non-exclusive form of a pedophilic disorder, not in terms of consequences, obviously, but in terms of what they are experiencing mentally. In other words, the fact that they're capable of having sex with an adult doesn't erase the fact that they're having extremely strong urges to be sexual with children, and that still needs to be dealt with in its own right. Now, to stay on topic, and I want to, again, looking at the time, I want to leave about 10 minutes for questions here at the end. I mentioned the paraphilias that are based on the kinds of behaviors a person craves. Paraphilia is related to the kinds of categories of partner a person is attracted to. Thirdly, I talked about the intensity of sexual drive. I'm going to skip that because there's really not time here. And instead, I want to talk about the fourth category, attitude. There are some people who are sexually attracted to children. The fact that they are is in no way in conflict with a personal sense of right and wrong. In that case, their desires for children are said to be ego-syntonic. There's other people who are sexually attracted to children, and it's a terrible conflict with their conscience, their personal sense of right and wrong. Those desires are said to be ego-dystonic. And again, I have some examples here of that, but there's just no time to go into it. So what I want to do is make sense in this PowerPoint out of what can sound like psychobabble or jargon to the public in terms of what I, as a mental health professional, would mean in diagnosing a paraphilic disorder. And so in the middle of the PowerPoint, let's say I have with me a gentleman today, and I've said the diagnosis is ego-dystonic homosexual pedophilia of the exclusive type. Let me just break it down. I said this is a man with pedophilia, so it's a man attracted to prepubescent children. I said it's homosexual pedophilia, so it's a man attracted to boys. I said it's the exclusive form of pedophilic disorder, so he's not attracted to little girls, he's not attracted to women. And by the way, he's not gay, he's not attracted to adult men. By definition, he's attracted exclusively to boys. And I said something about his attitude, it's ego-dystonic. Even though he's experiencing these attractions, he doesn't want to act on them, he doesn't feel it's the right thing to do, and he's very open to the idea of receiving treatment. Now, this is information not conveyed if I tell you a diagnosis of pedophilia. It doesn't tell you anything about a person's character, temperament, personality, intellect. We may be talking about a person with a very good character, a person with high moral standards, and so on. It doesn't mean it's a person lacking in social skills. In the old days, we taught people with pedophilia that they needed to have more social skills. The idea was they turned to children because children are easier. None of that made any sense in terms of how we understand it today. Again, no time to go into it, but it's not about a need to exert power and control over children. It's about having an attraction to children. All right, so I want to talk about etiology, and again, we often look at nature or nurture, but there's just a couple of points that I want to talk about here that I think are particularly important. And the most important point isn't what a disorder or a condition like pedophilia is due to, the extent to which it's nature or nurture. I want to talk about what it's not due to, and that is it's not due to voluntary choice. Now, what do I mean by that? When I was a little boy, at any point did I say to myself, look, you've got some choices. Do you want to grow up to be attracted to women? Well, I don't know. That's pretty conventional. Do I want to grow up to be attracted to men? I don't know. Maybe I want to be attracted to little boys or little girls. In growing up, none of us weigh our options and decide who it is we're going to be attracted to sexually, or for that matter, what kind of sexual desires we are or not going to experience. In growing up, we discover the nature of our own sexual makeup. It is not a choice we make, it is a discovery we make. And I've talked to many men, to just pick an easy example, who are attracted exclusively to young children. I have not met one, I'm sure there might be some exceptions, but I've not met one who told me if I had the choice, which he did not, that he would have decided to grow up to be sexually attracted to children. And so the first point I want to drive home, and perhaps the only one here, is that take-home point, is that people do not have pedophilia because they've chosen to have it. They discover that to be the nature of their own sexual makeup. Perhaps I'll say for the question period, nature or nurture, there is a lot of information there. Those are probably entirely different talks, but let me make sure I cover some of the other points I want to make here. Now, I am saying it's not my fault I have pedophilia. It is my responsibility to do something about it, but as with drug addiction and alcoholism, doing something about it may require getting access to appropriate mental health treatment. I talked about choice and making the point it isn't my fault that I'm attracted to children. I did say it's my responsibility to do something about it, but again, the idea of doing something about it needs to again look at how much choice an individual has in terms of willpower alone. Choice is not the same when it comes to all the decisions we have to make. For example, if a man puts a gun to my head and says, it's your choice, your money or your life, well, theoretically that seems like a choice, but in matter of fact, in terms of degrees of freedom, I have virtually no choice. The choice in that situation is illusional. On the other hand, if I decide in the morning, or want to decide in the morning, do I put in the green try or the blue try, there's virtually no impairment in volitional decision-making. I can easily choose either of the one. There's no problem. But when behaviors are driven by powerful biological cravings for alcohol, for heroin, and so on, often willpower alone may be difficult for an individual. It may be that they need professional help. Let me talk about the appetite for food and then the appetite for sex to really drive home the point that I want to make here. And then I'm just going to talk briefly about prevention and perhaps open up for a few minutes of questioning. Americans are spending millions of dollars a year trying to diet, trying to lose weight. And all sorts of doctors have waved in. So I'm Dr. Fred Berlin, and I will tell you the guaranteed 100% sure way of losing weight and successfully dieting, and it's this: eat a little less every day. It's absolutely no more difficult than that. And yet, what is the mental experience of the would-be dieter? Let's say it's New Year's Eve. I'm trying to diet. I really want to. I'm sincere. This is the year. It's a New Year's resolution. I'll take off 10 pounds, maybe 20, and I really mean it because I'm not hungry and I'm convinced I can do it. What happens is I begin to get hungry, and you're watching my behavior. You see something that looks like simply sneaky, premeditated behavior. Why is it sneaky? Well, I told the wife, I told the kids. I don't want anyone to know. And why does it look purely premeditated? Well, I never saw a bread drawer or refrigerator walk itself up to the bedroom. I get up, I walk down to the kitchen, I open the refrigerator, I get some bread, I slather some cheese on it or some mayonnaise. I promise myself just a little, but I then gorge myself. As soon as I'm done, I promise myself never again. I mean it, and yet as I get hungry, for so many who are trying to diet successfully, my willpower, my resolve weakens, and I again act similarly. Now, people could argue, okay, Doc, that's not fair. You have to eat to live. You don't have to eat. You don't have to have sex in order to survive. But let's step back and look at the big picture. It's true if I don't eat, I can die. But if we all stopped having sex, the human race would die. God or nature put that sexual drive into each of us for a very important reason, and that is the preservation of the human race. And so if a person is experiencing misdirected sexual drive, if I am experiencing strong, recurrent sexual appetite, which all of us have and we want to satisfy, but that appetite is misdirected towards wanting to expose myself in public or towards wanting to engage in sex with children, I may need, because of the power of that powerful biological appetite, to have professional assistance in the same way a drug addict or an alcoholic does. All right, I've just been told I just have a few minutes left, so let me talk about prevention, and then I'm going to open up for questioning. And this is something I feel very strongly about. You know, we pick up the pieces when we're trying to deal with this problem after someone's committed a crime, after a child has been hurt, after someone's exposed himself in public, and so on. When do we ever, we hear all the time on television or radio, if public service announcements, if you're having problems with depression, if you're having problems with drug or alcohol, if you have an eating disorder, please come in and get help. As I speak now, there are numbers of young adolescent boys, let's say 17 years old, privately aware of the fact they're not attracted to peers their own age. They are already aware of the fact they're attracted sexually to much younger children. And yet, with the stigma that we put on this in our society, the last thing they're going to do is raise their hand and ask for professional assistance. We ought to be having, as they're doing in Germany now, in my opinion, public service announcements saying if you're worried about the kinds of sexual feelings you're having, if you're worried you're going to lose control sexually, if you need help in this area, for goodness sakes, come in and get that help before you hurt yourself, before you create problems for others in the community. As some of you may know, there's a group on the internet now called Virtuous Pedophiles. And unfortunately for the average person who understands nothing about the points I've been made, that can sound like an oxymoron. But if we understand that, we can appreciate that there is no oxymoron. The people who are interested in talking about virtuous pedophilia, A, want individuals who need help to be able to come forward and get it. They don't want them stigmatized simply because they're experiencing sexual attraction to children. They want them to feel good about themselves if they're not acting on those attractions. If they're struggling not to act, they want to come in for professional assistance. Again, I'm going to close here that the fact that we have done so little about prevention in this area is really something that troubles me a great deal. I am involved with a program at the School of Public Health, the Bloomberg School of Public Health here at Johns Hopkins. It's beginning to look at child sexual abuse as a public health issue and to appreciate many of the issues I've been talking about today. I'm certain I'm at the end of my time here, so I believe I should stop. And then if there is any time left, I haven't used all of it, I will be able to respond to questions that are read to me. Again, I'm sorry I didn't have time to cover a bit more material, but I very much hope this has been of some help to all of you. Thanks for having asked me, and if there is any time, I will take any questions at this point.
Hello, Dr. Berlin. Are you hearing me all right?
Yes, I hear you very clearly.
Right, okay. We've got a ton of questions. We do have a little bit of time left over, and I'll just try to focus in, I think, on a few. There were a lot of really great, fairly personal questions about defining paraphilia and defining pedophilia. How can a person find the right treatment, and is there a list of certified programs?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I do worry about it because, there are different theories out there. Some people talk about the containment model where we're, protecting society from people with pedophilia. I care about the human beings who are coming to me. Obviously, all of us recognize that in providing treatment to someone with pedophilia, and the people in treatment understand that, we all have a responsibility to community safety. Any citizen has that. So I think that probably contacting ATSA, the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, there's a lot of useful information there. There's an organization called the Safer Society. Certainly people can contact me through my email. If they're close to us, we're happy to provide care and can try to provide referrals. But it's a really important question because I want people who are seeking treatment to get that. I want them to have support, to be treated like a human being, and I want them to know that there won't be someone who misinterprets mandatory reporting laws. They didn't get a chance to get to this and report someone who really ought not to be reported. So try ATSA, the group I mentioned, Safer Society. People can contact me, but you do have to be careful that when you ask for help that you're going to indeed get help. I can understand people who are worried if I raise my hand, am I actually going to be helped, or is something else going to happen to me?
Great, thanks. Another question, let's see, in a different direction. Do you think there's ever any reason that someone should be civilly committed? Are there just some people who, because we know there's so many people who end up civilly committed for where it's not truly a pedophilia?
Yeah, I have
Sure.
tremendous. Yeah, I thank you for the question. I have tremendous problem with civil commitment. Juries sometimes have a difficult time deciding if someone even did or didn't commit an actual criminal act. Now they're supposed to decide whether it's likely that in the future someone is going to do so, and they're asking mental health professionals such as myself to make that prediction as though we're capable of doing it with some degree of certainty. And this is probably a whole topic that I feel badly I don't have the time to go into. But I worry that as a mental health professional that civil commitment is a ruse, that it's really been a way of taking people who haven't been given lengthy sentences, they've served their time, they've paid their debt to society. When they said up front, for example, I have pedophilia, I need treatment for the disorder, most prosecutors likely don't give a lot of weight to that. And then having served their time, they're due to come out. Now we have a hearing that says they do have pedophilia. That's going to be a disorder used as a basis for civil commitment. The prosecutor is now going to argue because they have pedophilia, it makes it difficult for them to control their behavior, which for some people may be true, absent effective treatment. And now the solution is we've deprived them even further, perhaps indefinitely, of their liberty for a crime that we're predicting they're likely to commit. There's something very wrong, in my view, of that picture in a free society. Now, we absolutely have to figure out a way of having a free and safe society. But, there's a difference between asking the question, how can we be safe? That's one question, from a second question, which is, how in the context of being safe can we still be safe and just? And that's where the question ought to be. We want to be a safe society, but we also want to be a just society. The safest thing to do with anyone who's been driving while drinking is to give them a life sentence, because that person will never again be a drunk driver, but it wouldn't be a just thing to do. Similarly, the safest thing to do with anyone, who's looking at child pornography would be give them a safe sentence. Again, it's certainly not a just thing to do. So I don't have all of the easy answers, but what I do know is that legislators, people in mental health community, people in the criminal justice community need to come together and come up with reasonable proposals that are both safe and just, instead of what's happening now, where some horrible crime is committed and then we rush to legislation. We're not necessarily concerned about whether it's both safe and just, and then the exception to the rule, somebody's raped, kidnapped, and murdered a child, causes new legislation to go on the books that affects a bunch of people who aren't that exception to the rule, and results in something that, like registration, probably does nothing to safeguard society, and that ruins a lot of families of both victims and offenders. So I could go on with this. Obviously, I feel a passion about it, but we really need to get together in a thoughtful way. And now when we're talking about criminal reform, justice reform, when we're talking about civil rights and so on, I know the last thing they want to do, unfortunately, is link this to the paraphilias, but let me tell you, in some ways, there's a lot of similarity when it comes to these issues.
Sure. Okay, we've got about 3 more minutes. Can you give us an opinion on mandatory reporting? In some states, I think, and a lot of people, rightly or wrongly, are concerned that a treatment provider in particular is required to report. And what are your thoughts, suggestions, the ethics of that?
We published a study in the American Journal of Psychiatry many years ago where I wanted people to think about the downside of mandatory reporting. There was a time in Maryland when we didn't have to report if an adult came in on their own seeking help. And over a 10-year period, we had 70-some individuals who came in, and we accomplished a lot. And these were people that nobody knew about before. They came in on their own and wanted help. After the law changed, people still call. We have to tell them they might be reported, and no defense attorney advises them to come in. So to address it sort of from the modern day point of view, in California, they're now required to report to mental health professionals are required to report if someone comes in indicating they're accessing child pornography. And given the penalties, particularly in the federal system, that are so severe, I can't imagine why people are going to take that risk. In Maryland at this point, and I hope it stays that way, we're not mandated to report if someone comes in viewing child pornography. We have many people now, numbers, who've come in either on their own or with family encouragement, and we're helping them. We're helping them be in control so they don't have to worry about being arrested. And again, child pornography I don't think is a good thing, and so we're doing something that I think is very useful. To give my view in general, I've always been in favor of mandatory reporting when I, as a professional, see an abused child. I have to identify the perpetrator. I have to put a stop to the abuse. Maybe other children are being abused. But I think we have to give a lot more thought to a law that is deterring undetected people from coming in and getting the very treatment that might make the community safer. Again, we're not talking about amnesty. We're not talking about people getting off the hook who are already in trouble. We're talking about wanting people who genuinely want help, who've not been identified, the law, we don't know about them, coming in and getting the assistance they need. In Germany, they're now doing it. They have something that translates in English into the Darkfield Project. They're having public service announcements. It's early on, but they're reporting numerous people are coming in for help. They don't have to mandatorily report, and they feel they're helping both the community at large and they're helping the individuals who on their own are coming in and seeking help. I'd love to have a thoughtful dialogue about mandatory reporting in this country, but there is just so much heat and so little light that it's hard to have that talk in a thoughtful way because of the intense passions that seem so quickly to come to the surface.
They do. And with that, our time is up. Dr. Berlin, thank you so much for being here. And we've appreciated your talk. I'm sorry to all the people who weren't able to get all their questions answered, but we'll try to have you back on another time or share with us in another context.
Thank you, and it's a privilege to be here, and I very much support the very important work that you're doing. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, sir.